My name is Peter Turnbull. I'm currently president of the British Universities Industrial Relations Association. So it's my pleasure to welcome everybody to this webinar today. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd just like to thank our colleagues in BUIRA Scotland for organising this event, and also Professor Greg Bamber, who from Monash University, who will be our questioner tonight. We'll have an opportunity for everybody to pose questions during the session. There's a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We also have a chat function that will be open that everybody can see. So you'll be able to send messages and say hello to other people who you may not have seen for some time. I'll do my best to collate some of the questions for a session of Q&A at the very end. So if everybody's clear on that, I'll come to the main reason why we're here tonight, and that's to welcome Professor George Bain, who is well known to everybody in the industrial relations community in the UK and much further afield as well. If I can just reflect on my own academic career, when I was an undergraduate at Leeds University, finishing my economics degree, in my final year, I went to seek advice from Professor Rodney Crossley, who at the time was the Montague Burton Professor of Industrial Relations, and asked him what I should do, in terms of furthering my career. And he said, you should read this book edited by George Bain on industrial relations in Britain and go to Warwick and do the MA in industrial relations. And I suspect there's a fair few other people on the call tonight who've followed a very similar path. I'm sure there are many other people here who, at various points in their career, have got to know George and have been influenced by his work and his role. So it's my honour to welcome George this evening, Professor George Bain, now Sir George Bain, and I'll hand over to Greg, who's going to be our questioner this evening.
Well, thanks, Pete. Good day. I'm in Melbourne, and on such occasions in Australia, we generally acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. And welcome, George. Why did you decide to study labour economics and industrial relations, or IR, at uni? And then after doing a doctorate at Nuffield College, Oxford, decide to make an academic career in IR?
Well, two broad reasons, family and Oxford, I think. First of all, family. My grandfather was a boilermaker at the Canadian Pacific Railway and head of the Boilermakers for Western Canada. My dad was also employed at the CPR. He was a carman and president of his local branch, or shop steward, if you like. And I had 10 uncles and aunts. My dad was the eldest of 11, and all of them were left-wing, and many of them were labor activists, shop stewards, and indeed, in one case, a communist politician. So this greatly influenced me. And in my own case, in the year before I went to Oxford, I was the president of the New Democratic Party, which is in Manitoba, not federally, which is a rough equivalent for the Labour Party. So I came out of trade union and socialist background. And when I went to Oxford, I was intending to go there only for 3 years, return to Canada, and become a politician, a provincial politician, underpinning that with being a labor lawyer. And it didn't work out. And it didn't work out because when I arrived in Oxford, it was a very exciting time to be in industrial relations. Union membership was increasing. Strikes were a problem, a major problem. In fact, they were called the English disease. And labor governments were in power. The reform of industrial relations, the Donovan Commission, the Oxford School with Hugh Clegg and Allan Flanders was dominant. And I got a research fellowship, and the rest is history. I decided to become an IR academic rather than a politician back in Manitoba.
Our paths first crossed when I was a student at Manchester, and the staff and students there were inspired by your dynamism when, from the Oxford School of IR at the age of 30. Manchester appointed you to a named chair in IR. And you changed my life, George, since you and the people around you that you brought from Oxford, including Jill Wolven and others, inspired me to work in IR. And that's why I'm asking these initial questions of you. But we were disappointed in Manchester when you gave up your chair to accept a non-professorial appointment at the then new Warwick University as Deputy Director of the IR Research Unit, or IRU. Why did you do that?
Well, it had certain benefits. It had certain costs as well, which I'll come to. But first of all, the benefits. Hugh Clegg was not only my supervisor and mentor at Nuffield, he eventually became a friend as well. And this would be an opportunity to work again with Hugh. So that was a very big attraction. It was likely that the unit, or IU, was going to become a major international center of excellence, which it did, but it wasn't guaranteed at that time, but it was likely. And thirdly, I was engaged on a comparative union growth project, and the unit and Hugh would agree to support that financially. So those were the attractions. Of course, it had costs. I gave up a chair for a readership. I took a 10% cut in salary, and I exchanged tenure for a 5-year contract. But it had compensations. I got the chair largely because of the working of the neoclassical economics. At that time, everybody was trying to appoint staff to industrial relations, and there weren't simply enough people to go around. Demand exceeded supply. I didn't deserve a chair, and I certainly wouldn't have got a chair if I'd graduated 10 years earlier. Easy come, easy go. So I decided to give it up, and I've never regretted that. And I certainly wasn't the youngest person to be appointed to a chair, but I think I became the youngest ex-professor in the UK, and I've never regretted that. It was the smartest move I've ever made.
Well, the people in Manchester were certain that you did deserve a chair, George, so you're a bit too modest there, perhaps. But IRU will celebrate its 55th birthday this year. What do you think, briefly, are its most significant contributions?
Well, 3 or 4. One was a demonstration effect. It was one of the first attempts to bring together a large group of social scientists to do team research. And the ESRC, or SSRC in those days, hadn't done this before. Warwick turned out to be successful, and of course, it launched many more units after that. So one of its achievements was to show that team research, large-scale research in the social sciences was feasible and desirable. Secondly, of course, it had a huge research output. And Milton Derber, a very well-known, now dead, of course, but very well-known American industrial relations scholar, said around 1980 that he found the research in industrial relations in Great Britain the most impressive. And of that, he found the research at Warwick most impressive. So we use that, of course, as an advertising slogan, but I think it had an element of truth in it. So the research record. And then there was the public policy aspect. A lot of the research at Warwick informed public policy, not just for governments, but also for employers and also for unions. And that was important. And finally, I think the Warwick diaspora, or the Warwick Mafia, as some people would have it. As I said, in relation to my chair, there was a huge demand for industrial relations people in government departments, in FE, further education and higher education institutions, and employer associations, personnel departments. And Warwick, through the MA Industrial Relations, supplied this. Also, LSE, Ben Roberts and the LSE department supplied it as well. But I think Warwick even more so. And that was perhaps the most profound intervention of the unit. And it was complemented by Pete's reference to textbooks. Of course, Hugh Clegg's and Allan Flanders' original textbook back in the 1950s was the dominant one, and then Hugh did several others. But then I and other people at the unit continued to produce these textbooks, and that had a great influence on the subject.
Apart from textbooks, you spent 20 years researching the factors that promote or hinder the growth of unions and published several books and articles on this subject. Why?
Well, when I came to Oxford in '63 from Canada, the flavor of research and industrial relations were very much plant-based and interested in workshop bargaining, shop steward movements, etc. And as I said previously, I was thinking of returning to Canada to work as a Labour politician, and I wanted to do something that would be useful to the trade union movement in Canada. And I didn't think learning all about a plant in Coventry and the shop steward movement was going to be as useful to me as certain other subjects. And eventually I landed on the growth of unionism, and particularly white-collar unionism, because this was growing very rapidly in Britain, and it wasn't growing in North America. So I thought by studying that, it might be useful when I returned to Canada. So that was the first reason. A second reason was, as you mentioned earlier, I studied industrial relations and labor economics at the University of Manitoba, my local university, very much like a University of Glasgow or Strathclyde or Queen's University Belfast. It took largely people from the local area. And I did labor economics. And within that, as you're well aware, there's a very well-developed group of theories on union growth, and I studied these, and I was interested in them from the point of view that the trade union movement in Canada and the United States, for that matter, was far weaker than the union movements in Scandinavia, the UK, etc. And I wanted to understand how it might grow. And then, of course, Allan Flanders, who, as I said, was my joint supervisor along with Hugh, revealed to me that after about 3 years, that he had written a manuscript on union growth when he'd had a sabbatical earlier in his career at Oxford, and asked me to join him on a comparative research project on union growth that would cover several countries. And that offer was too good to refuse. And unfortunately, Allan then went off to the Commission on Industrial Relations. He then had a stroke in 1970, and he died in 1973. So our working partnership was cut short. And the growth project would have been much the better for it, and several other things for that matter, if he had lived longer. He died in his early 60s. And as a result, I then worked with a group of other people to complete the growth project.
Thank you, George. And some universities in the UK are still fostering thriving groups of IR academics, but unfortunately not all universities are investing much in IR these days. Why do you think the subject is still important, and what are its prospects?
Well, I think the first thing we need to do in answering that question is define industrial relations. And if it's defined as it was traditionally defined, certainly when I started the field, as labor management relations, collective bargaining, industrial conflict, etc., then it has declined. But the question why is very simple. The answer is very simple. Union membership and union power, particularly in the private sector, has declined enormously, both in the UK and in America and in several other countries. So but I think it's still very important. First of all, in the public sector, traditional IR is extremely important, as we in Britain still know, through all the public sector strikes that we've experienced in the last year or two. And I think the public sector makes up 20% of the economy. But I think it's also important in the private sector. And I think if one was starting today, we would call it not industrial relations, but employment relations. And the unit at Warwick would probably be called the Employment Research Relations Research Unit or something like that. And it's a much broader concept than industrial relations, which tended to be focused on the traditional manufacturing and extractive industries. It includes state employment rights, such as the national minimum wage, for example. And the chairman of today's session, Pete Turnbull, in discussing the arrangements for the seminar, said it's now studying the problems for labor rather than labor as a problem. And I think that's a very good statement, actually. And topics such as productivity, diversity, equality, and indeed, Greg, a unit that you're associated with, Digit, for Digital Futures, which is looking, as I understand it, it's a long time since I've been involved in industrial relations, at the impact of digital technologies on employers and employers, etc., indicates that it does have a good future. And I want to end up by saying that I think the key task of IR is to pluralize human resource management. I mean, human resource management, as I understand it, is the effective and efficient management of employees. And it has, by its nature, a very unilateral perspective. And I think that those of industrial relations know that cooperation exists, but conflict is inherent in the employment relationship. And that's an important perspective to bear. And I think business schools in particular, and I've been the dean of one, and well, I was chairman of Warwick as well, needs to introduce a critical perspective into business school teaching and research. Obviously, our teaching and research should be relevant to the needs of managers and employers, but I don't think that we should be their passive and uncritical servant. I think that we should use our teaching and research to question, to discover, and to innovate. And I think that's the most useful role that IR people can play in universities more generally, but specifically in business schools where a lot of IR has now been relocated.
Well, good to hear your thoughts on the field, George. And moving outside the academy for a moment, you've been an arbitrator on many, many industrial disputes. You've served on numerous government commissions. And just to take two of those, the Bullock Committee on Industrial Democracy in 1975, 1976, and the Low Pay Commission, the LPC, of which you were the founding chair in 97, 98. Bullock's recommendations were not accepted by the then Labour government, whereas those of the LPC were accepted, and the national minimum wage, the NMW, is now seen as a very successful public policy in the UK. Why was Bullock a failure and the LPC a success?
Well, I mentioned two or three reasons, I think. First of all, union solidarity. On Bullock, workers on boards presented unions with a dilemma, because the form of board representation for workers that gives them the most influence, parity, and representation on the main board, etc., is also the form that lumbers them with the greatest responsibility for the decisions that the board reaches and compromises their independence from management. And as a result of that dilemma, the union movement split on Bullock. The center, the general unions, both white collar and manual, supported worker representation. The far left, the communist unions, were against it, and the far right, the electricians and the engineers, for example, were against it. So the unions were split. On the national minimum wage, the unions were agreed. The TUC had supported the principle of the national minimum wage since 1986. And Tony Blair and the Labour Party, when it came in, were determined, it was in the manifesto, and they were determined to implement it. So union solidarity was certainly part of the explanation why Bullock was a failure and the Low Pay Commission was a success. A second thing was commissioner unanimity. On Bullock, the commissioners split. They both had 9 commissioners, the usual tripartite arrangement, 3 trade unionists, 3 employers, 3 independents. And on Bullock, they split into 2.5 groups. I say a half because the 2 of the independents, myself and Bill Wedderburn, supported the union side, and the employers were all opposed to it. But the other independent, corporate lawyer, actually supported the unions, but not on 2 or 3 details. But I think the important point to stress here in passing is that the employer supported the principle of workers on the board. That, I think, was the fact that Britain was viewed as ungovernable in those days. But the commissioners split, like the unions split over Bullock. On the national minimum wage, we were unanimous. And my experience of chairing commissions is that unanimity is extremely important. If you're unanimous, it places great strains on the government of the day not to accept the report or to alter it and impose its own wishes. But I think the third point is the most important, the nature of the subject matter. The national minimum wage was concerned with a technical question. What should be the level of the minimum wage? What should be the ways in which it was enforced? What should be its definition? Those questions can all basically be reduced to pounds and pence answer, to a monetary answer, which, as everybody in industrial relations knows, monetary matters are infinitely divisible and compromisable and hence resolvable. Bullock was not concerned with a technical question. It was concerned with a power relationship between unions and employers, capital and labor, if you prefer. And I don't think those sorts of questions so readily lend themselves to mediation and compromise by independents.
As you mentioned a moment ago, George, you've been the leader of 3 academic institutions, Warwick Business School, London Business School, and Queen's University, Belfast. These were all success stories, as far as I can see. Do you have any lessons to offer others about becoming academic leaders?
Well, when I was on the eve of retirement in 1964 from Queen's, and indeed from academic life, I wrote an article for the Times Higher Educational Supplement entitled George's Guidelines, and it had 10 commandments or guidelines for prospective vice chancellors, and indeed, I think more chief executives of organizations. And I don't have time this morning to go through all 10, and all 10 aren't worth going through, but I'll mention 2 of them. Lead more, manage less. I think a lot of, I'll keep it in terms of vice chancellors and university presidents, a lot of vice chancellors see their job as managing. And by managing, I mean producing order and structure and harmony out of chaos by introducing rules and systems, the sort of things that business schools teach. I think that's very necessary, but I don't think it's the main part of the job. I think the main part of the job is leadership. And by leadership, I mean to get people to change, to move in due direction. Warren Bennis, I guess an industrial sociologist in America, once said the task of leadership is to set the target that beckons and to inspire other people to follow it. And I think that's a very good definition. And I think that vice chancellors and chief executives of organizations would be well versed to follow, to emphasize leadership more than management, and to leave management to a chief operating officer, usually called a registrar in universities. They shouldn't be worrying about catering and the maintenance of buildings, etc. They should be worrying about other things. I was in the Navy for a while, the Royal Canadian Navy, although I'm sure the definition of leadership came from the Royal Navy, like other things in the Canadian Navy at that time. It was the ability to get other people to do what you want done because they want to do it. And I think that's a very good definition of leadership, particularly in universities.
Well, thanks, George. And forgive me, I think you made a slight slip of the tongue there. You referred to being on the eve of retirement in 1964, and I think you meant 2004. You were on the
2004.
you were.
My memory is not as good as it was.
No, it's brilliant, but you were then retiring as the VC of Queen's University.
Yes, I was.
20 years ago, George. What have you been doing since then?
Well, I for the first 10 years, I didn't change much. It's often said that 75 is the new 65. And I carried on chairing inquiries, including a second stint for 6 months at the Low Pay Commission when the chairman resigned at short notice, and also chairing the Resolution Foundation Commission on the future of the national minimum wage. I was a non-executive director of some companies in the UK and Canada, and I engaged in a lot of fundraising for cultural organizations and charities since I'd done a lot of fundraising as a university president. But in the last 10 years, and for the future, whatever future I have, I've been doing personal development. I have completed a number of personal projects that I was engaged on, family histories, etc. I wrote an autobiography mainly for my children and grandchildren. But recently, the last 2 or 3 years, I've begun to study philosophy. And I began with distributive justice, the question of what is a fair or just distribution of resources, particularly income and wealth. I'd studied these questions empirically, of course, for many years, and never thought about studying distributive justice. Didn't even know about it, really. I'd heard about people like Rawls and Dworkin and Nozick, etc. But I began studying that, and I got a university professor to commission a reading list for me, and what he would expect a PhD student to read on this topic. And it took me about a year to finish that. And like I always told my students, you don't know anything about a topic until you write essays about it and collect your thoughts and separate the wheat from the chaff, etc. And I wrote about 40,000 words of essays on these topics. And I've since gone on to do freedom of speech, to finish that. I'm working on democracy at the moment. And I will go on to, if I live long enough, to liberalism versus conservatism. And finally, I've had a long-standing interest in capitalism and inequality. So I will do that. But I return to where I started on distributive justice, and reflecting back, I think this should have been embedded in industrial relations courses much more than it was in the past and in the future, because it raises all these philosophical questions about what is a just distribution of resources, which I think is particularly appropriate at the moment when we have right-wing populism in the ascendant.
Well, thanks, George. There are many more questions that we could discuss, but I'm going to hand over to a fully paid up member of the Warwick Mafia, Professor Melanie Sims, who is currently the Dean of Research at the University of Glasgow, not far from where you're sitting now, George. So thanks for now, and over to you, Mel.
Thank you very much. And it's a real pleasure to sit and listen to your reflections, George. As you were talking, I was really struck both by the continuity and the changes of some of the challenges we face, both as academic leaders, but also as industrial relations scholars who are trying to shape the world with the research that we do. And I just wanted to sort of reflect on some of those continuities and changes, and then perhaps end with a question for you. With regard to continuities, I really, my role as Dean of Research for the College of Social Sciences in Glasgow, a lot of what I do is encouraging staff to really scale up their ambition in thinking about the real difference that social science research can make when it's done at scale, and with the kind of teams that you were talking about at IRU. And the policy relevance of their research. So these are conversations that I have day in, day out with staff, particularly obviously in the schools that I lead with the research activity, but in general with social science. I think we can often be much more ambitious about the scale and the relevance of our research, and sometimes that can be the importance of that to policymakers in particular, demonstrating the broader relevance of findings. It really came out very strongly of your reflections at the beginning of the conversation. I was also struck by some of the reflections of the benefits of industrial relations analysis, both in terms of allowing us a series of lenses through which to understand work and employment, but also perhaps be better, I use that word slightly tentatively, leaders, and to lead rather than manage, and understanding the inherent conflicts in the employment relationship and how leadership works in that context. And I'll come back to that point in just a second. I was also struck by your reflections on the difficulties of the challenges of securing support for different forms of regulation. Some of us in the webinar today will be very actively participating in consultations around the Employment Rights Bill that's currently going through Parliament, and really experiencing firsthand the challenges that brings. And I think your reflections are particularly useful. I note that Jim Phillips, who's a colleague of mine at Glasgow, has noted in the Q&A a paper that you contributed to, your reflections of Bullock contributed to. And I think there's much to learn from many of our colleagues, of whom you're a particularly standout example, who've actually done those kinds of done that kind of work before. So there's certainly a lot to learn from your reflections there. I was also struck by the changes that you highlighted. So union decline perhaps being the most obvious, and how that's shaped not just the focus of some of the questions that we ask as academics, but also regulators ask, and governments and employers and those kinds of things. But also the focus of the academic discipline, and how that's taken us into new questions. And I certainly find in my own research practice that focus on and using an industrial relations lens through which to understand contemporary developments in labour markets is incredibly useful, but it's not always useful to assume that everything has stayed the same. So I think that came across very strongly, and in my view correctly from your analysis, whilst also noting particularly things like the continuity of a lot of public sector employment relations structures. Even there, I think we see a lot of change, and I think devolution has brought to the fore some of the different approaches to regulation in the public sector even. So there's still a plethora of questions I think that we can all attend to and ask. What really struck me as well was your reflection on the labour market, academic labour market, and the moments where industrial relations scholars were particularly in demand. I think many of us in this room would long for that day. And whilst there has been a turn to a reflection on the future of work, is often how it's framed, and I'm sure we all have different views about what that means and how we take that. I think we have seen a decline in academic context, in the academic labour market, for reflections on work and employment generally. I'm very lucky at Glasgow that we have a very broad-based area of expertise. So those of us who self-define as industrial relations are only a very few of us, but the network of people involved in questions around work and employment is far broader. We have a network of about 50 or 60 colleagues at Glasgow, and that's extraordinarily useful. It takes us into new questions and new perspectives and new disciplinary perspectives, which I also think is incredibly fascinating. So I was really struck by both those continuities and changes, and the way that the field, the discipline, call it what you will, I like Paul Edwards' definition of the field of industrial relations, has changed and adapted over time and has much potential to continue to change and adapt over time. That came out very strongly from your remarks. But I want to, if I may, ask a question about academic leadership. And in my own experience, a background in industrial relations is incredibly advantageous to my own academic leadership, my own approach to academic leadership. And I'm really fascinated in your reflections on the value of an industrial relations background as an academic leader, what that's brought to your own practices and experiences. So I'll pass back to you.
Well, a very interesting question. And like you, I think it's been very helpful to me personally, and perhaps more important to other people. If we just take vice chancellors and university presidents, everybody knows about Clark Kerr at the University of California. But during my academic career, I can think of 3 other industrial relations scholars who were American, who were presidents of American universities. I can think of 6 people who were IR scholars who became head of universities in Great Britain or the United Kingdom during my time. I can think of at least 1 in Australia, and no doubt others. And of course, it just isn't the chief executive role. There's all the middle managers, the PVCs, the deans like yourself, the heads of departments, etc. And I think it might be an interesting research project to ask the question, do IR people punch above their weight in terms of being academic leaders and politicians, etc.? And I think the answer is probably yes. At least if I was investigating that question, that would be my hypothesis. And the question is why? Well, I don't know why, but I would venture a guess. I think it's because we adopt a pluralistic vision of organizations. By that, I only mean that we know that there are elements of cooperation, of course there are, but there are elements of conflict, and it's imperative. And in academic institutions, you can't operate like Donald Trump or many chief executives and come in and operate by diktat and degree. And perhaps, as Trump is doing at the moment, fire everybody. That's just not an option. You have to get people to agree and to negotiate with them. And I think that's, I think some people are startled when they find that. IR people aren't startled. They know that's the nature of the game. And perhaps they're been mediating and arbitrating, and perhaps they've picked up a few tricks, I certainly did, in how to negotiate that agreement. But who knows? In 19 93, the deans of the business schools at London, Wharton, and Harvard and Stanford were all Canadians. And Henry Mintzberg, the management guru, was the president of the Strategic Management Society, which was meeting in Toronto. And he invited the three of us to come there to reflect on why Canadians were so good, or so numerous at least, at running business schools. And Henry, of course, from this sample of three, which was a big sample for Henry, had a grandiose theory that Canadians were more tolerant, etc. And at the end of this, Dick Remoult, who was a scholar from UCLA, I think, rose to his feet and said, "Henry, I have a simpler solution to why Canadians are so good at being deans of business school. Deans have no power, and Canadians are used to that." So who knows whether my explanation is correct, but I think it is at least worthwhile for hypothesis that we are used to conflict, and conflict is inherent.
And I think that makes a nice segue to the Q&A section, which Pete will host. And Pete has certainly done some work with talking to employment relations scholars more broadly about some of their leadership practices. I think I'm passing over to Pete.
Yeah, we've had a few questions there, George. There's one that I'm kind of quite interested in, which goes back to your point about the importance of the textbooks produced at Warwick, and then also the kind of team research. And those teams produce definitive texts on shop stewards in action, absenteeism at work, equality and fairness. And I'm just wondering whether you think that obviously as a dean of a business school and then a VC, being involved with the REE and the REF, and the emphasis, certainly in our field, on journal articles, and whether that has kind of dissipated the influence of IR. When you had these definitive texts that were produced about the role of shop stewards, which debunked a lot of the kind of false impressions that we had of these people. Do you think that, something I was kind of reflecting on when you were highlighting the importance of those texts, and when we think about that historically, do you think that's maybe one reason why people just don't know so much about industrial relations these days?
Well, I don't think that's a major factor. I mean, I think the REF has distorted research by emphasizing articles over books. I mean, spending 3 or 4 years writing a book without any outputs today is a very dangerous research strategy for a young researcher, I would assume. Pumping out an article every 9 months is a much smarter strategy. But some things don't lend themselves to articles. I mean, economists, philosophers largely work by articles. Historians, labor historians and other historians largely work by books, and the humanities works by books. But the reason I don't think that the REF has been responsible for reducing textbooks is that textbooks have never counted for very much in terms of REF. Even before REF, you didn't get much credit for producing a textbook. It was almost a public service, producing a textbook. And of course, if you produced a best-selling one, we didn't get the royalties at Warwick. They were contributed to the unit. But Samuelson, for example, who wrote a best-selling textbook on economics when I was a youngster, became a millionaire as a result of writing a textbook. Textbook didn't writing wasn't discouraged because of the ref, I think. It was discouraged because of the fact that textbooks don't count much in your promotion prospects. You're really doing a public service, I think, and those of us who work, and after Hugh, of course, I think, if memory serves, and if it doesn't, you will correct me, all the textbooks were edited. They were chapters that people contributed. Nobody wrote a full text, and they did it largely as a service to the profession and a service to students.
We've had a really interesting question from John Holford about, I suppose this relates to a broader issue about adult education and the role of shop stewards, and whether you thought that that was part of the role of industrial relations and maybe the unit in the 1970s as kind of shop steward education. I mean, I certainly remember when I did the MA at Warwick, there were shop stewards on the course, and whether you think that had either directly or indirectly had an effect on the conduct of industrial relations, the fact that there was that education and workers' education programs at that time.
Well, I think a huge impact. I'll go back to Oxford for a start. Ruskin College, the trade union college at Oxford, produced people like, to mention only a few, Bill McCarthy and Derek Robinson and John Carina. All of them came up through the shop floor. It produced John Prescott as well. In fact, I had the experience of tutoring him in economics in '64, and they eventually went on to become not Prescott, but the others I mentioned, to become industrial relations scholars. And a huge amount of my early activity at Oxford was lecturing for the WEA, the Workers' Educational Association, and to shop steward courses, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know, but I'm assuming that has all disappeared today, largely. But it had a huge impact on the conduct of industrial relations scholars. And I think by importing all these people who had been on the shop floor, in the mines, et cetera, it had a huge impact on the discipline.
Yeah, yeah. And there's another, I suppose, related to this as well. There's a question that's coming from Clive Morton about, he was saying when he did his PhD on the construction industry, some of the kind of misconceptions around that, and you talked about trying to get everybody on board, with Bullock Commission and such like, and some people have devoted their academic and practitioner lives to trying to resolve disputes in industry. Do you get an impression these days? I mean, you talked about trying to pluralize human resource management a bit. Do you actually perceive that there's either a lack of skills amongst practitioners or just a lack of willingness to try to resolve, workplace issues, conflicts that you mentioned in the way that it was done in the past?
Well, Pete, I don't really know because I haven't been involved for the last 2 or 3 decades so much. I don't know if there is a lack of will to resolve disputes so much as, at least with employers, with the decline of union power and union membership, there's a much greater ability to not resolve the dispute, but to impose a solution. And I think of the fragmentation of employment, the gig economy, working from home, the growth of self-employment, which is often a term that is usually used because it's not so much self-employment as gig employment. people have an ability to impose a solution. My main contact with workers, I suppose, in the gig economy is I take a lot of taxis and I talk to taxi drivers. Basically, Uber is imposing terms on them. They don't negotiate the terms, etc. And I assume all the people that deliver all the parcels to my door, people are imposing terms on them. And it's either take it or leave it. So I'm not sure the ability to mediate and negotiate has declined so much as the willingness to. Employers no longer have to. Amazon being a classic example, and the tech companies. You just working from home, for example. I'm reading news feeds that tell me if you don't want to work here, then don't come into the office. It's not negotiating how hybrid working will occur or not. It's just imposing unilaterally a set of terms and conditions.
We have a question from your old friend Richard Hyman in the chat here. Richard's just saying that one of the achievements of the Warwick Industrial Relations unit was to develop comparative work on the world of work. I think we were talking about this before the webinar today. And Richard's made the similar point that this is increasingly difficult with budgetary constraints and some of the performance indicators. Richard just asked, have you got any reflections on this about, how we might maintain that kind of tradition of research?
Well, as you say, Pete, we were discussing it just as we were waiting for the waiting room to fill up. And it was a very important aspect to industrial relations research. And indeed, the project on which I worked for 20 years, the Union Growth Project, was a comparative project. And it covered several countries. And it was extremely useful as a comparative methodology because you could, by studying various countries, Scandinavia, in those days, Scandinavia, America, Britain, Australia, etc., were the usual suspects. You could get a much better appreciation of the dynamics at work, which were determining the industrial relations outcomes. How you could best foster that today? Well, short of rejoining the EU, which doesn't seem to be on the table, closer working. I mean, many of the research agreements fell by the wayside when Brexit occurred. And I don't know really how it could be fostered except by closer international working. And also, perhaps since at least in the short run, we're not going to rejoin the European Union. Perhaps professional associations. I mean, does the International Industrial Relations Association still exist? I assume it does. Then it seems to me there's a role there for that, and together with the national associations like BUIRA and the American and Australian and other countries could organize perhaps better than they have been doing. But the lack of funding is the big thing, I suppose. And that I don't have a ready answer to.
We actually have the European conference for the International IR Association at Durham later this year in September. So in addition to the BUIRA conference, this is a quick plug for everybody on the call. We also have the European meeting as well, and it's great that we're hosting that in the UK, despite the fact that we've been that we've been cut off, I suppose, in a way. Um, there's a there's a question here from Peter Prowse about the relationship between the national minimum wage and the living wage, having a voluntary living wage that people buy into. Do you have any reflections on that, George, about how that might be promoted more, from your experience with the Low Pay Commission?
Well, I think the national living wage, which was designed initially and conceived by people at Loughborough, I think, was a very valuable concept. And I think, although I was delighted to see the Chancellor, George Osborne, accepting the Resolution Foundation's recommendation that the Low Pay Commission should be given a remit to go to eradicate low pay, in effect, by setting a target of 2/3 of the median. He muddied the waters by calling it the living wage. The national minimum wage is not a living wage, and it's not intended to be. It's intended to be perhaps a living wage in combination with benefits, etc. But I think the living wage, in the sense of Loughborough, was a valuable addition to the national minimum wage, which employers could sign up to and pay a higher rate, because the national minimum wage, by its very nature, strikes a universal wage across the economy. And subsectors could obviously pay much more than the national minimum wage. And that has gone. But the national living wage still exists. I don't know. The national minimum wage was $11.44. I think it's just been set as $12.25 from April, but I stand to be corrected on that. And the living wage would be a pound or more above that, particularly in London, which that was the other advantage of the living wage, that had a separate rate for London, which is a case unto itself from the rest of the country. But I don't know how you can promote it more in this environment, with companies really in a bargaining position that they dictate the terms. I mean, it's interesting that several of the supermarkets signed up to the living wage and paid above, because they wanted to cream the market and get the best workers. And perhaps that's the answer.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question. Yeah, but, Howard Gospel, I've not seen for ages. Good to see you on the call,
No,
Howard.
I haven't. Hi, Howard.
So I suppose this is a question to reflect on your current back to school activities, if I can call them that, George, studying philosophy.
Yes,
And I just wondered,
absolutely.
if you were designing the MA in Industrial Relations at Warwick today, how would you think about incorporating some of those topics, freedom of speech? Because in a sense, we teach some of these things around, employee voice or bargaining, but actually talking about it in the context of freedom of speech, distributive justice, it's a different way of a kind of that philosophical kind of approach to that. How would you see that working in what we teach, I suppose?
Well, I don't know is the truthful answer, but to reflect on it on the spot, so to speak, industrial relations was a very empirical subject. And Richard Hyman is in the audience. Richard and I did our PhDs or DPhils together at Oxford. And he did the great service to introducing a much more theoretical perspective to industrial relations. And I think in terms of distributive justice, which, as I've reflected on it in the last couple of years, is really the underpinning of our concerns. It's much like the question of what is a just war? What is a just wage or distribution of resources? That's a fundamental question. And I think it would be an option, at least paper like labor history, labor economics, perhaps ethics or equity questions. I think one of the greatest problems today is growing inequality, and it just has mushroomed beyond all expectations. And I think it threatens freedom of speech. I think it threatens democracy, etc. And we don't have to look very far to get pressures for that, to get evidence for that. So I would certainly introduce more. And I think Richard actually in the old days did a bit of it, but I think it would be much more central to industrial relations today. And just like your comment that in the 60s and 70s, and in the 1950s for that matter, people viewed labor as a problem. And I thought your comment about now it's problems for labor rather than the problem of labor is a very good way for looking at the subject. And hence a whole new raft of topics are available for research purposes.
Yeah. Thanks very much for that, George. Well, it's been a fascinating conversation. I mentioned at the start that BUIRA as an association was really grateful to our colleagues in Scotland for organising the event. So I'd just like to finally hand over to Stuart Johnson. Are you with us, Stuart?
I am, Pete. Thank you. Thanks for that. A really interesting conversation. I think quite a while ago we started a conversation, one of many, about where the field is going of industrial relations, and we thought it would be useful to have this conversation, which thinks about where the field has come from, and we try to think about where it might be going, and obviously as well what we can do to shape it. On the one hand, it's easy to look at it as a field which has been a story of decline from its heyday when IR was prominent, and IR specialists were frequently sought out for their expertise by governments, policymakers, and by universities. And it's easy to be pessimistic, I think, given the decline of trade unions, collective bargaining, the rise of HRM in business schools, and as we mentioned earlier, fewer large concentrations of IR researchers and departments. On the other hand, I suppose there's optimism. The key concerns of IR, labour management relations and conflict, they're unlikely to ever go away. Neither are, I would suggest, the broad concerns that IR has with improving work, reducing inequality, reducing poverty, developing fairer societies, the challenges of governing the employment relationship, all likely to stay with us. And I think IR has strengths given its multidisciplinary and multi-level nature, and its understanding and its emphasis on understanding the governance of the employment relationship. I think in contrast to what we might describe as mainstream HR research, the unitarist variant, which we've talked about in the call, which has even in HRM journals been criticised in recent years as tending towards academic esotericism and mental gymnastics, understandable to very few, with few implications. And on the other hand, work in the IR tradition, as outlined by people like Hugh Thomas and Pete Turnbull, showing how work and employment research informed by the industrial relations tradition continues to be impactful, engaged, and policy relevant. Of course, we all, as IR scholars as well, have the opportunity to be impactful in our teaching, writing textbooks, as we mentioned, and rejecting this unitarist vision of the employment relationship, and looking at things which appreciate the contested nature of the employment relationship. And I think in the UK at the moment, where are things? Well, I suppose with the changing political environment, the Labour government's New Deal for Working People, the Employment Rights Bill, which Mel mentioned, and the opportunity for us to input into that has some potentially significant implications for worker rights. And I think it means industrial relations expertise, broadly defined as not only in demand from academics, but also in the world of practice, as organisations need to think about how they manage employment relations issues in a way which they haven't perhaps had to think about for quite a while. And I think obviously as well, the role of BUIRA as the professional association in the UK to promote the field, to shape the agenda, and to support the next generation of researchers. So I would like to thank everyone for supporting this webinar, to those attending, but in particular to George Bain for kindly accepting our invitation and patiently dealing with and addressing with our many inquiries to try and make sure it was as smooth as possible. And it was good getting to know and to talk to George Bain in the organisation of this, not least learning that his father is from the same small Scottish town where I grew up, and few people ever know where it is. So it was good to have that in common as well, George. Thank you. Thanks to Greg Bamber, who has been doing a lot of the organisation in the background, to Pete Turnbull and Mel Sims for their input and contributions today, and to Dustin Hafke and Clara Oldfield, who have been helping with the administration of the event as well. So thanks to everyone for joining us virtually from Glasgow and from Melbourne this morning, this evening. So that's all for today. Thanks again to everyone for coming along. Thanks to all our speakers. I hope you enjoyed the session, and I hope you have a good day or a good evening. Thank you.
Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. When the union's inspiration through the workers' blood shall run, there can be no power greater anywhere beneath the sun. Yet what force on earth is weaker than the feeble strength of one? But the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. It is we who plowed the prairies, built the cities where they trade, dug the mines and built the workshops, endless miles of railroad laid. Now we stand outcast and starving mid the wonders we have made, but the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. They have taken untold millions that they never toiled to earn, but without our brain and muscle not a single wheel can turn. We can break their haughty power, gain our freedom when we learn that the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. In our hands is placed a power greater than their hoarded gold, greater than the might of atoms, magnified 1,000-fold. We can bring to birth a new world from the ashes of the old, for the union makes us strong.